Ronald Reagan he talked of free trade for sure, but his policy was very much a populist economic policy. And I was there. I sat in the room with him. I saw what he did, and he took very, very bold steps. Not as bold as what we did in the Trump administration, but the situation was less desperate. So what did he do? At that point, as Michael suggested, we were really kind of under assault by the Japanese, who did a lot of the things that the Chinese are doing now, but they didn't do the cyber theft and all the kind of hostile things, but a lot of the same economic policies they did. But the difference, as I always say, is they wanted to get rich, but they didn't want to eat us, right? The Chinese want to get rich and actually become number one. They always kind of viewed themselves as under our umbrella. So we saw trade deficits go up very, substantially. And he put in what we call voluntary restraint agreements. Now VRA is not a term anybody uses anymore, but in those days, this is before the last trade round, you were allowed to have agreements between countries that say we're going to limit the amount of imports that come in from that country. And the way you got that, of course, is you went to, for example, the Japanese and said either you limit it or we're going to stop you from coming in. And there was a real, in autos, for example, there was a real movement to put quotas on Japanese automobiles. I mean, it was a very popular among Republicans as well as Democrats, and could have possibly passed. So he negotiated voluntary restraint agreements with the quotes around the voluntary to limit the increase because the Japanese were literally taking over our auto industry. He did the same thing on steel for most of the world. He did the same thing on specialty steel, which is another category. He put in place a program for semiconductors because while we had invented the semiconductor, the Japanese, using, as I say, mercantilist policies, not unlike ones you'll find that I talk about with China, and they had essentially taken over the semiconductor business. And so he put a limitation on that, and had a semiconductor program. He did. He famously put a limitation on motorcycles coming in because they were literally wiping out Harley Davidson. So he went down the line when something came up that threatened America. Ronald Reagan took action, and I would say one of these libertarian groups, when Reagan left, said that they thought he was the most protectionist president since Hoover. So the libertarians just hated him. And then the final thing he did, among the final things, was what Michael mentioned, and that was the Plaza Accord. So a good part of the problem all the way through, and by the way, it's the problem now too, is we had a currency that was too strong. And so you're running big trade deficits. And what Jim Baker did is he got everyone together in the Plaza Hotel in New York and got them to agree not just to change the value of the yen, but to change the value, our value of our currency relative to 5 or 6 key currencies. And when that happened, it takes a while for that to change the direction of the battleship. But when it did, it got the trade deficit down. So Ronald Reagan was by no means a free trader. He thought about trade, about how you would expect a smart, patriotic, pro-American person to think about trade.
Where did conservative trade policy go wrong after Reagan?
Well, so there was always this, I've spent time thinking about this and I don't really have a complete answer. There was always this sort of sense that we were free traders. But let's just take a step back. So you start off and you have Republican presidents, right? Every Republican president from Lincoln up to Hoover, every one of them, if you said, are you a free trader? They would say, are you nuts? If you asked Teddy Roosevelt that, and I have the quote in there, he famously said something like, free trade destroys the fiber of your body. So every one of them, Lincoln, every one of them, if you ask, they all would have said, no. They all would have been in that. They wouldn't have all used the term protectionist, but a lot of them would have. But they would have certainly said, we need tariffs. We need kind of an industrial policy. We need to build up America's industry. Every single one of them. All right, period, without exception. Then you come to the Second World War. Now you have Eisenhower, who also took some actions that were very much in agreement with the way I think and the way you think. But Eisenhower's objective was different, right? He was in a world where he was trying to take on the Soviet Union, and there was only one economy in the world, right? There wasn't the kind of competition that we think of, right? There was one economy that was left after the Second World War, and it was us. So you fast forward from there, you look at Nixon in 1971, the trade deficit's going up again. What does Nixon do? He uses, you could argue whether he had the authority to do it. There was a lot of litigation, but he put 10% tariffs on the entire world to get the trade deficit down and stop and then renegotiated the value of gold to stop the run on the gold. So if you kind of go, you don't really see a lot of this kind of action, but there was this undercurrent, which kind of goes to your sense that somehow tariffs are like taxes, and we're against taxes, therefore we should be against tariffs. And then at the same time, there was a kind of a libertarian element to conservatism, which is, which to me, at least philosophically, since a lot of you probably think of yourselves as both, to me, they're philosophically very different things. And that kind of influence had an effect on some people. And then the other thing that was going on had nothing to do with philosophy at all. It had to do with just money, right? So you had big corporations bringing manufacturing overseas, making a lot of money, importing, being influenced by Japan and then China because they want access to the U.S. market, and we're worried about consumption and not production, and we don't care about workers. What we care about is television sets. And so that kind of took over. It kind of fanned this little embryo and fed it with money, in my opinion, so that people would start saying that. But if you look at Republican platforms for most of our existence, they would be clearly state we need tariffs to build up our industry.
So you guys changed this consensus pretty thoroughly during the Trump administration. And I think if there's one reason why institutional Washington is at all willing to go along with your perspective now, it is China. In the book, you spend a lot of time talking about the singular threat that China is, both in terms of the history of the United States, how it's never had a great power that is as competitive with it as China, but also just more broadly, the malfeasance that they engage in. I want to hear more about your perspective on China, but to start, are you frustrated at all that every concession on trade policy made by the traditional Republicans or the Uniparty in DC is being laundered through the lens of national security? Do you think that everything you want to see done on trade policy can be done through that lens alone?
So I mean, I'll come back to the question of China generally, right? But to some extent, in the discussion in Washington, people who either view themselves as free traders or think they should be free traders, right, which is a different group of people, or don't want to challenge people who aren't free traders, will say, well, we have to make an exception because of national security. So it tends to kind of just create its own argument, right? It's just something that tends to happen. To me, the most fundamental thing is that, and I'm a national security hawk also, as you can imagine, right? I'm sure no one would have any doubt about that. But the first thing you don't want to do in national security, you clearly don't want to transfer weapon technology, and you don't want to give away your military secrets and all of that. Of course, everybody would agree with that. But I always say, but do you want to actually build the other guy's army? Do you want to create the Chinese Navy? Is that something we should be doing? Because that's what we're doing. We basically are funding. In other words, the amount of money they get from us is far bigger than they spend on their own Army and Navy every year.